We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today.
Attack. It feels like I've been talking to myself again, but it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you.
Good evening, welcome to NUFC Matters with me, Steve Wraith, the pre-recorded show with our good friend Ben Jacobs. How are you, Ben?
Very well, Steve. How are you?
Very good, mate. Very good. Good to see you. And as always, plenty to talk about. For 50 minutes we've got today, I think, to talk about Newcastle United. I did put a tweet out asking for questions. We've got a few questions coming in from our regulars as well. But I want to start with that PSG game last week, Ben. I mean, Newcastle, as we know, Champions League was going to be a big test for them. I think they've handled themselves wonderfully well. 4 points from PSG. That takes some doing for accomplished teams in the Champions League. What did you make of the game? What did you make of the result? And what did you make of the controversy at the end?
Well, I think, as you say, Newcastle handled themselves really well. And I think they've learnt on the road from each of the games that they've played. They were maybe a little bit too passive in the first game, but they battled and got a draw against Milan. Dortmund was disappointing, but I think you've got to give the German side credit in both of those games. Actually, they were excellent at St. James's Park as well. And then Newcastle knew what they had to do. They were positive. They took their chance. And then it looked like they were going to hang on. And the equalising penalty was nothing short of ridiculous. And you know when a VAR official is stood down within 24 hours of that decision, that there's a problem. And we're always going to get this, but the rules say one thing, but we don't like the rules, but we're just implementing the rules, but the rules are unfair, and we're going to go round and round and round in circles. So I think clarification on the rules is one thing. And I do think that by next season, we will have a clearer guidance as far as UEFA is concerned. So that kind of incident would not be a penalty. But I also think that when a referee of the quality of the one that was officiating the match doesn't give the penalty, then goes to the screen and decides to give it, it's just crazy. And Newcastle can feel robbed because even within the UEFA rules, the key point that people need to remember is that regardless of the apparent infraction, if the hand is in a natural position, they're still not supposed to give the penalty. So the fact that it's gone off his chest, onto his elbow, brushing across the arm, may look worse in slow-mo, it may look worse in freeze frame, but you have to consider it's point blank and the arm is low and in a natural position. And even under the current guidance of UEFA, which is different to the Premier League, that's never a penalty. And even if you make an argument that under current UEFA rules, you have to give it. And I think this is what a lot of officials say. They don't like the rule, but by strictest letter of the law, they can understand why it's given. I still disagree. Firstly, because if you've got officials that don't agree with the rule, why does the rule exist? But second of all, you've got to use some common sense here. Livramento has an arm. That's just the reality of football. Where's he supposed to put it? If he puts it behind his back, whilst trying to move or run, he can't do his job. If he puts it completely away from the ball, so there's no chance of it hitting the arm, he's off balance and it's in an even less natural position. The natural position of the arm is slightly out and slightly down when you're running, when you're challenging, when you're jumping. And if from point blank range, a ball deflects off a chest onto an elbow and brushes on that arm area, to give that as a penalty in an injury time as well, it's wrong. And I can understand how sickening it must be to Newcastle United fans, because that's probably, or potentially anyway, going to be the difference between getting out the group and not getting out the group. So I thought it was a shocking decision. And I was really disappointed in the official, because first of all, VAR should never have recommended he went to the monitor. And that's why I think that the VAR got stood down. But then for a referee like that, that's been in charge of a World Cup final, to change his mind from what he sees at the monitor, I just think it was a poor decision, regardless of what the UEFA rules say.
What's your opinion on them talking about bringing in VAR for free kicks, corners, throw-ins? I mean, Eddie Howe made a point in the press conference on Friday that he would be against that. He's always very careful what he says, Eddie, but obviously he's just been stung again by VAR. Not the first time it's happened to Newcastle, and won't be the last. But he feels that there's no issue with VAR with offsides. He says, okay, the lines are tight. He says, but at least you get a black and white decision. He said, but with handball, it's contentious. It's such an issue which, it's so unclear. There's no clarity in that decision. So he would be against, he said, bringing in VAR for and throw-ins until the technology can get the first set of rules right.
Yeah, I suppose every time we make changes in football, whatever they are, rule changes, technology changes, what we find is that there's a period of transition. And it may be that if you had a time machine and you went forwards 50 years, we have almost like AI refs. They work seamlessly and it's all soulless, but it's all scientific and accurate. And the game ends up being faster because of it. And everybody's happy. And we look back and we laugh at how annoyed we were about this transitional period. And I accept that technology has a very important part to play. And if you could, hypothetically, maybe it is a bit idealistic, get to a point where the technology was always reliable and accurate, then you would take that as long as it doesn't slow down the game. But right now, the issue is that decisions are being made not just by technology, but by human beings. And the human beings that are catalyzing the decisions, telling referees to go to the monitor or to take a second look, or guiding referees based on lines, they're not on the field. And I think that until we get specialist VAR trained officials, which might take 3 or 4 seasons, we run the risk of the game feeling a bit distant from the venue, like everyone's just waiting for somebody by a television screen and they're not accountable to the players on the field because they can't talk to them directly. And I think it's taking a lot of the power away from the official. So we have to get in a situation where if technology increases and is used for more things, the accountability has to be there to those on the field and also to fans in the stadium so they know what's going on. That's the first thing. I watched an NBA game last night and every single review or challenge, the crew chief went into a microphone and announced the decision. So everybody in the arena knew exactly what had happened. Whereas we don't get the process here. So if you come back to the Newcastle penalty, it's not given. And remember, it's supposed to be clear and obvious error. And then VAR decide to tell the ref to go to the monitor. We don't hear that conversation. We don't know the context. We don't know what the referee's seen on the monitor to change his mind. And nor does Eddie Howe at the time, and nor do the players. So all of that needs to improve. Otherwise, we're going to be in a position where technology may get things right, but it's so frustrating that you almost don't want it in the game. And I think the other thing at the heart of all of this is just, what do we want from our technology? Do we actually want every single thing by a millimeter looked at? Or do we want the referee to be a player? Do we want the subjectivity? Do we want the difference between refs? And is that actually part of the thrill of the game, because it gets us talking about it? Is the fact that there's a human being there officiating, and every human being is different, and everyone's got slightly higher bars and slightly lower bars depending on the guidance. So depending on the ref you get, it will be a different kind of game. Is that something that we want to embrace because it gets us talking, and it is important that that official in the middle can kind of catalyze that debate, because they're watching it live like we are? And if you ask 1,000 people in the stadium what they think of an incident, maybe 50% will say foul, 50% will say no foul. So can the referee be a part of that? And is that human aspect key to the culture of our game? Or do we want it to be so scientific and forensic that it's at the other extreme? So you always get accuracy, but maybe it's at the expense of the soul of the game. Maybe it's at the expense of the speed of the game. And I think we're in the midst of this debate now, and everybody's got a slightly different opinion. And I think I've said it before on the show, but I'll say it again in case some people were not listening. In baseball, you have a official who is umpire behind home plate, and there's no science to it. There's nobody in his ear saying that was a ball or that was a strike. It's totally up to him, and he's watching it from behind home plate, and he or she, who is the official umpire, has a different notion of strike zone. And the batters and the pitchers have to work out, is it a tighter strike zone? Is it a wider strike zone? Oh, that one dropped down into the left corner, and I thought it just clipped the edge of the strike zone and it was a strike, but he said it was a ball, so now I've got to adjust. So that's kind of the opposite extreme. And I think that people quite like that in baseball, rather than ask for the forensic science side of things. So I think it's an interesting debate in all of this as to whether we want humans or whether we want effectively science. And then the last thing I would say is just, if we're going to do it for free kicks, if we're going to do it for throw-ins and ball-ins and ball-outs and every little thing in football, then we have to have it near automatic or automatic. And we have to stop the game because we rely on the technology. Even if there was the odd instance where the technology breaks, we have to stop the game, because otherwise you always see the consequences and it's leading to this outrage. And I think I've said it before on this show. If a ball goes through to Anthony Isak and he appears to be clean through and the semi-automatic offside goes up, and then we never know if he would have scored because it's instant, then ultimately you can have the debate about, was he onside? Was he not onside? Is there an error of the technology? Is there any human error? Is there any error in interpretation? But if you just stop it, we never know if he would have scored. So it actually, for me, becomes less contentious because we just get used to the fact that it stops. But if we're going to let everything run on, and then we're going to introduce it for free kicks and for everything, then not only will the game always be slowed down, but we'll always see the consequences. We'll always see the goal or the save or a moment that becomes bigger. And then we'll always have to rewind, and we'll always have to wait for the technology, and it will always be highly frustrating to the flow of the game. So I think that I'm in favor of the technology if it's reliable and if it's near instant or instant. But you got to take out, if you believe the technology is accurate, you got to take out this always let it go on, always see the consequences. And I understand people will say, what if the technology fails? We want it to run on, so we always have the possibility of giving the goal. But I disagree. I think if you get to a point where the technology is reliable, stop the game, accept that the technology is perhaps even more reliable than the human eyes, move on. And then you never even know if that goal would have gone in. So then there's way less contention or debate. But what we're seeing is a bunch of aggrieved managers, because every single hot topic at the moment in technology is running its full course and then being looked at forensically and then being debated by both sides. And I just think it's leading to animosity. It's leading to people feeling like the officials making the decisions in the VAR room are somehow less trained, which is not necessarily true. It's just new technology. So of course there's less experience using it compared to being in the middle of the park. And then, as I said before, on top of all of that, we have to make sure that whoever's officiating retains that accountability and power. Otherwise, what's the point in having a referee in the center of the field if you can just use all of your decision making via somebody in a room miles away in charge of VAR? So there's a lot of work to be done, and hopefully we'll get there in the end. But right now, there's probably more problems than solutions that we're seeing.
Yeah, I think half the battle is getting referees to just say, well, actually, my decision was right. You know, we saw it with, you know, the early days of VAR, Michael Oliver being one of the first to actually say, well, actually, I've looked at what you've seen, I looked at what you've shown us, but actually my decision was right and I'm sticking with it. So I think Eddie Howe's point at his presser was that, you know, he would like to see more of that. He would like to see more of the referees go, okay, yeah, I can see where you're coming from, but I'm still going with the on-field decision. There should be more power, because at the moment in a stadium, literally, as soon as he goes like that, we know what's going to happen. 99% of the time, the VAR decision is going to stand. And it almost feels as if these people that we can't hear, you've already made that point, are making the decisions. And it's basically a referee just goes, well, I've got to do it. And that surprised me so much against PSG, because that referee, he's one of the best referees in the world.
Yeah.
He's done the World Cup final. He's done the Champions League Cup final. He's not like, you know, he's not just some part-timer who's a little bit biased towards PSG. I mean, I was shocked. And again, I think clarification of the angles that are shown, because on the replays on television, the angles that were shown, I can fully understand why a referee who got the decision right in the first place would look at those specific angles that were shown on television and go, well, that's a handball, because the camera angle from behind the goal shows quite clearly that the ball bounced off one part of his anatomy onto another part of his arm. You know, it's so frustrating, because the technology's there, and we keep saying it. It's the people in charge of the technology. But I think we need to get some referees who are going to grow a pair. And I thought that guy would have just said, I've already waved away one of these. I'm not going to look. I'm not going to look at this again. And I'll look at it, but it's definitely not a penalty because I saw the correct angle. So frustrating, Ben.
Yeah, and you know, then there was the day after, and Bayern get a penalty shout that is relatively similar, and that's not given. So obviously, there's no consistency. But again, it's about the language, I think, because we constantly say this word consistency, and we constantly say this word clear and obvious error. Now, when you accept the premise that certain things, regardless of technology, will always be subjective. There'll be some things that are black and white, where you draw a line, and even if it's a millimeter, it's black and white. There'll be some decisions that are always subjective. It doesn't matter whether you've got 1,000 camera angles, they'll always be subjective. And that is just the nature of sport. And that will especially be with things like fouls, potentially handball. So if we start with the premise that VAR is there to overturn clear and obvious error, it sounds like a good thing, because it suggests if the referee makes one decision and VAR say there's not enough there to overturn the on-field decision, then the on-field decision stands. And that sounds great. And a good example of that is obviously the Newcastle goal against Arsenal, where the on-field decision said ball in. There wasn't enough evidence to say otherwise. The on-field decision said offside and no foul. And you have to watch the footage over and over and over again. And you still can't tell categorically if the ball went out. You still can't tell categorically if Gabriel is falling first or is pushed first. And it's really difficult because of where the players are to look at the offside. So you say, okay, the on-field decision was everything was fine, so the goal stands. And as a result, technically VAR's done its job, because even if you forensically look at it and argue otherwise, there's not enough that VAR are able to deduce to overturn something as clear and obvious error. So it's a high bar. But naturally, if you go with clear and obvious error, then you're not saying that VAR is actually there to be forensic. You're saying VAR is there to back up a referee or correct a referee, and it's there to intervene if there is a glaring error. So If something is kind of 50-50, if something is subjective, if something is up for debate, even if the people in the VAR room think if that was us in the middle of the field, we'd have probably done this. But you've said that on the field, and we have to stick with that on the field, because our job is not to be forensic and waste time and look at everything over and over 1,000 times. Our job is basically to say, have you made a shocking error, or could you make an argument that your decision on the field is correct? And if you can make an argument that the on-field decision is correct, even if the devil's advocate, the counterpoint, is also quite strong, you're supposed to uphold the decision. Now, that doesn't lead to consistency, and we need to understand that if that is our VAR, then VAR is not there to be forensic. It's not there to get everything absolutely scientific. It's there to let the referee do his job and then to intervene if the referee makes a shocker. So it kind of depends what VAR you want, because some want the science and some just want VAR to only make that intervention if it's clear and obvious error. If we're saying it's clear and obvious error, then maybe we're not looking for consistency. We're not looking to retrospectively go back and be too scientific about it. We're just looking for VAR in the moment to see whether they can find anything in that moment from the angles available that significantly suggests the referee has made a howler. And even if there's a 20%, 50% chance that the referee is correct, should VAR be saying, wait a minute, we want to look at this a million times and we want to find a way to be as scientific as we can. Actually, what we want to do is just see it in real time like you saw it in. And if we kind of agree with why you've given it, we move on, because you're the referee, you've got all of the power. And I think that clear and obvious error way with a higher bar for VAR to overturn it is better. But if you're going to have that clear and obvious error, you should never have sent the ref in the Newcastle PSG game to the monitor, because then not only does it say to that ref, maybe you've made an error, but it's also VAR pre-making the decision, because they don't send the ref to the monitor unless they think it's a penalty to begin with. And that's at the back of the referee's mind. So then 99 times out of 100, when the ref goes to the monitor, he will end up giving the penalty. So it's just really frustrating because there's no clarity here. And I think the guidance from the rule makers needs to say very clearly who has the power, when it should be intervened. And I think that if we're going to use VAR, we need to have a much firmer sense of what is its purpose. Is its purpose to actually take the final decision and be as forensic as possible? Is its purpose to only intervene if the referee's had a shocker? Even if there's an argument for intervening more, it lets the game flow because the referee has all of the power. Is there a halfway house, even though it's a bit more gimmicky, where it doesn't really intervene, but managers can have one challenge each half, which means that you just let the referee do his job? But if there's a penalty shout and it's either given or not given, and a manager wants to get VAR to take a look at it, could they potentially challenge it? But the difficulty, I think, in all of this is that if you look at basketball, where a coach can challenge, they've got monitors, they've got analysts looking at it all the time. Whereas if Eddie Howe's on the touchline, what good is really an Eddie Howe challenge? Because he's not seen any of the footage. So unless you're going to give the managers iPads and a direct link to the VAR room to have a look, and then it slows down the game, I just don't think it helps. Because what manager, if they get a penalty against them, is not going to stick their hand up and challenge? What manager, if they want a penalty, is not going to stick their hand up and challenge? But they've not seen any of the angles. They've not seen any of the lines. They've not really got a sense in real time, which again tells you that real time is one thing and freeze frames and replays are another. So there's never going to be a solution, which means that there has to be a structure and there has to be a clarity as to what is VAR and how should it be used. And right now, I think we've got confusion because UEFA is different to the Premier League. But again, we have clear and obvious error on the one hand, and we have lines and forensically looking at something at the other hand, and they're not the same thing. Clear and obvious error and forensically looking at something are not the same thing. So if you say clear and obvious error, you're solely correcting a referee if he's had a shocker. And if you can make any argument that the on-field decision is correct, you have to go with it. Whereas forensically looking at something is saying, I can understand why you've given that decision. It doesn't appear wrong in real time, but we're going to look at it anyway from every conceivable angle to see to the millimeter, or based on 50 angles or based on 20 slow-mos, whether you were right or wrong. So that's where we need to define what the purpose of VAR is, because if we don't, we're going to go round and round in circles with all of these debates, and everyone's just going to be frustrated by it.
Okay, halfway through the show, time for the ads.
A big thanks to all our sponsors: Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. A big thanks to Mr. Vicky's sauces. They are handmade in Cumbria. If you want to order some of these sauces, call 01768 210 102 or go to the website mrvickys.co.uk. Thanks again to United Group Travel. They are a UK coach holiday firm and they are based in Morpeth with pickups throughout the Northeast. No strangers on our tours, just people you haven't met yet. They're on Facebook. They've also got a website, unitedgrouptravel.com, or give them a call, 01670 632 460 or 0791 666 4174 or 07957 141 654. Big thanks to Darren Baldwin Funerals. They're an independent funeral director based in Gateshead. You can find them at their website, darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk, or give them a call, 0191 478 2730, or email Darren at darrenbaldwinfunerals.co.uk. Big thanks to Neil and the lads at Media Arts for all the help with the video side of things. And a big thank you to New Workwear. You can find them at newworkwear.com. If you want to help the channel, then please subscribe. Hit the subscribe button underneath today's video. Hit the thumb up, which helps you like the video, and please click share and share it to your other social media. We're also available as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast providers. If you want to help the channel, you could take out a one-off membership. You get a cup, a pen, a membership card, and a scarf. It's a £25 one-off fee, and you can go to nufcmatters.com and click membership, or put your smartphone over this QR code, and it will take you straight there. We also help the food bank on this channel. If you want to help the food bank virtually from wherever you are in the world, click on nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk and it takes you to the match day bucket and you can make a donation no matter how big or small. I'm also involved in the Northeast Footy Breakfast Show. You can find us on the tooneuk.com. I do Monday to Friday with Ted, the Sunderland fan, and Rye, the Borough fan, and Radio Dad Dave. Lots of fun, 7 till 9 every morning. Give us a listen, you'll not regret it. We also help support people in the area who are putting events on. An evening with Nobby Solano takes place on the 19th of January at the Tyneside Irish Club. And an evening with Peter Beardsley takes place at the Tyneside Irish Centre the week before, on January the 12th. Tickets for both events are available on Voucher and would make fantastic Christmas presents for anyone of a black and white persuasion.
Okay, thanks to everybody who sent us some questions in. We've got a couple here. Tom Dixon and Craig both want to know about transfers. We're into December now and January's just around the corner. Tom wants to know if you think Newcastle will make a move to sign Neves on loan, or do you think they will make it a permanent signing?
I don't think it will be either in January. As I've said many times, there's a long-term openness of Ruben Neves to come back to the Premier League and play Champions League football. But January, even the summer, very difficult. I know we have some reports that suggest that he'll be a target. I also think that Eddie Howe fueled that a little bit when he said that he admires the player, or did so when he was still at Wolves. But a really important point I think we should make in all of this is Al Hilal. And people wrongly assume that it's an easier negotiation for Newcastle to do business with Al Hilal because it's PIF talking to PIF, but it's also PIF talking to the Ministry of Sport, effectively from Newcastle's perspective. And if Newcastle want Neves and the Saudi Pro League deal makers feel that him leaving at this point is bad optics-wise for the Saudi Pro League, then there's only going to be one winner in that conversation. It's not going to be Newcastle United. So I think what is true, even though Newcastle may now shout it down, and the official line is no negotiations. But I think it's true that Neves was considered on loan internally by Newcastle. That's what I understand from talking to sources. But obviously, officially, nothing ever came of it. And I think the reason for that is, again, like I said before, it's a much harder negotiation for Newcastle to do business with Al Hilal, specifically for Neves, because the PIF people on behalf of Al Hilal don't want the player to go. They are top of the league and they're pushing to win an Asian Champions League. And if you set that precedent that a player can go to Al Hilal and come straight back after only half a season, then broadly away from just Newcastle, Neves and Al Hilal, that sets a bad precedent for the Saudi Pro League that they're trying to avoid. They're buying these players and paying them handsomely to keep them in Saudi Arabia. So there'll be significant opposition from Al Hilal about letting Neves go in, for example, January, even on a loan deal where he could potentially return. And I think Newcastle know that. And obviously, if a non-PIF controlled club came calling, then maybe the player could push a little bit more. But it's arguably more difficult for Newcastle to go to the same group and say, can we pull a player away? And the irony is that during the takeover, even now, we constantly have this debate about Newcastle's legally binding assurances that show that they're not government controlled. Whereas in the Saudi Pro League, there's no debate, it's public. The Ministry of Sport openly admit that they are the ones funding the Saudi Pro League. They're the ones working with PIF and the other clubs to do the deals. The sports minister is often part of the strategic conversations, but also even some of the transfer negotiations. And that's because the centralized pool of funding is not just PIF and their money. It comes from the Ministry of Sport, and you request that money from the Ministry of Sport. So if the Ministry of Sport are involved in the 50 odd million that they paid for Neves, then if there's any conversation about letting Neves go, they have a say, which means that when Newcastle are effectively in a room trying to get a player like Neves, and maybe he's an anomaly because perhaps in the long run, if Newcastle want to do business with other PIF clubs and the player's been there longer, maybe they can get a benefit. Maybe it does become an easier deal. But specifically with Neves, you're in a room, not just PIF talking to PIF, but PIF talking to government. And there's simply no way that the Saudi Ministry of Sport want to be seen to bring a player like Neves over who's young, who was a coup mid-season, and say, sure, you can go to Newcastle, because actually Al Hilal and the wider Saudi Pro League is bigger than Newcastle. It's not a case of Premier League trump Saudi Pro League, even if that's what potentially Neves thinks. It's a case of the project of the Saudi Pro League is far bigger than Newcastle's project. And that's why I actually think that it will be harder, not easier, for Newcastle to try and get Neves in the short term. In the long term, though, it may be a different story.
Okay, another question about transfers from Craig Elrington. Hi, Stephen Ben. Do you think Newcastle will go big on a striker in January or just bring a younger one in? Ekitike has been linked again.
Yeah, and again, Newcastle love to deny an Ekitike link, and that's because they were frustrated by previous attempts and they felt a bit strung along by the agent. But those close to the player and on the PSG side still maintain that Newcastle are one of a number of clubs that may come in for a loan for the player. Everton have tried in the past. West Ham have also tried in the past. And Ekitike actually wanted to go to Crystal Palace in January, but only on a loan. And PSG wanted a mandatory purchase option. And this may be the challenge, that the player wants game time and minutes and is open to a Premier League move, but PSG want to get rid of him. They either want a fee or they want a loan with a mandatory purchase. And it may be that Newcastle or other clubs prefer either a straight loan or a loan with an option. So it's the right kind of profile for depth. It's the right kind of profile financially speaking, because Newcastle are going to have to be quite conservative. And I do think that they'll be looking predominantly, if not exclusively, at loans in January. Some may depend on whether Sandro Tonali surrenders a proportion of his wages during the ban. That might help free up some money. But, you know, even though people are saying that gives Newcastle a bit more leeway, I don't know exactly what Tonali's on, but even if it was 150,000 a week and it isn't going to be that high, you're still only talking, I say only, but you're still, talking about what, 6, 7, 8 million, however long the ban is. And that would be if he surrendered 100% of his wage, and he's obviously not going to go unpaid during the ban. So I think in modern football, where you're looking at 10, 20, 30 million almost minimum to get a decent Premier League player, even a young Premier League player, to assume if Tonali gives up 50% of his wages over the next 9 months, that's still not going to get you the money you need to move particularly aggressively in the market. It will help, and it may pay the wage of someone also that you bring in on loan. So you might be able to offset the wages from a loan versus what Tonali gives up. And that might allow you to balance the books. But I don't think it's going to make such a difference that Newcastle can suddenly go out and sign someone for 60, 70 million or whatever. I think that will come in the summer, especially if they get Champions League football again. So there's no doubt Ekitike is available on the market. But, I'm sort of torn. I don't know what your thoughts are, Steve, but I'm kind of torn in this, because if you buy young, they're not going to get that many minutes. And some of the players being linked with Newcastle want minutes. Ekitike wants to play. He's not happy because he's not playing at PSG. He's not necessarily going to be happy if he's on the bench as a result. And then Sergio Gurasai is the other one that's being linked. He's 27 years of age. So if he comes in, he's going to want to play. I think he scored 16 goals for Stuttgart this season in all competitions. He scored 15 in only 9 Bundesliga games. So again, if you go for a player like that, he's going to turn around and he's going to say, I expect to be playing most weeks. And that's why I'm torn, because I understand Newcastle have had some horrible injuries. I understand that Newcastle want depth because they're challenging, hopefully in the Champions League in the second half of the season, but also to qualify for Champions League football. But I also look at Newcastle's 4-3-3 and I say, okay, Anthony Isak, when fit, is starting. When Callum Wilson is there, he's contending for that leading role as well. Almiron, at his best, is starting. Gordon's been just about Newcastle's best player of late. Yes, Harvey Barnes is injured, but he's still got a plan in the long run for when he's back. And he got into double figures of goals for Leicester last season. So he can come into that front line and score goals. He's also versatile and can play in a different position. You got Joe Linton, who can play in the front three in a 4-3-3 if needed, or he can go back and play in central midfield. So it's kind of all very well saying another striker would be great, but there's really nobody out there that I can see starting in that Newcastle 11 at the moment, even with the injuries, because nobody's replacing Gordon in that starting lineup when he's fit. Nobody's replacing Isak in that starting lineup when he's fit. And I personally think it would be harsh to replace Almiron in that starting lineup when he's fit. And I think anyone considering a January move that wants minutes has to be aware of that. And obviously there's only going to be more players coming back.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, look at how well Lewis Miley's adapted to life in the first team in the Premier League and in the Champions League. Elliot Anderson, who we all thought was going to have a great season this season, still laid up, still on the still under the microscope, I guess, of the doctors. He's had another scan on Friday, so still no return date for him. But I guess football moves on. I mean, it's all about having a big squad, and it's Eddie Howe's job to keep that dressing room happy. So at the moment, he's managing to do that, and I think that is why they pay, they paid Dan Ashworth and his team the big money to get these kind of things right. I mean, Yankuba Minte started off like a house on fire. He ended up injured across in Feyenoord. He's come back with a bang. He looks as if he's a player who could probably go into the Newcastle United first team squad or pool. So he may intentionally, we're all asking, should we be bringing in a new striker? Should we be bringing in a youngster? We've already got one on our books who potentially could come in and hit the ground running. So it's exciting times as a Newcastle fan. I keep trying to keep my feet on the ground and tell people to do exactly the same. But it's exciting. It's a lot better than trudging around in the old Premier League bottom three, mate, and waiting for Mike Ashley to decide if he's going to sign anybody or not in the January transfer window. Things have changed massively for us.
I think so. I think it's also, though, a formational I don't want to say issue, because 4-3-3 is 4-3-3. It's the preferred formation. It's working for Newcastle. But I think that football lends itself towards fans, maybe more so than managers, wanting these attacking players, wanting these goals. And if you play a 4-2-3-1, then you can effectively have 4 attack-minded players. If you play a 4-4-2, you can have 2 out-and-out forwards, and some of the attack-minded players in your 4-3-3 can go into wider areas in midfield. But if you play a 4-3-3, then your wide players are wide forwards. They're kind of wingers come forwards, which means it doesn't lend itself necessarily. Like, I know Isak can go wide or central, but generally there's a lot of like elite number 9s out there that really want to be like focal points. So they are going to be better if there's 2 of them in a 4-4-2 than one of them having to go out wide. And if I put Newcastle into a 4-2-3-1, then it's obvious that Bruno could go deeper. We know that Joe Linton is versatile and can go deeper. We know that Longstaff can go deeper. And then suddenly you've got a 3 and a 1. So you've got Isak or Wilson, and then potentially whichever one isn't playing could go behind them. Wilson, I think, would be very capable of playing behind Isak. And then you've still got 2 wide players in that formation that would allow you for a Gordon or a Barnes or an Almiron. If, for example, you played a 4-2-3-1 formation, you might even be able to have like a Livramento or a Lewis Hall be developed into going into midfield, because I think that they're very capable of that. If you stick with your 4-3-3, then of course you've still got 3 forwards in that front line. But I still think that the way that Eddie Howe plays is quite wide, and you definitely want your Gordons, your Barnes, your Almirons in that wide role, because Isak's not as effective playing there. Wilson's not really geared towards playing there. Joe Linton can play there, but I actually prefer him playing in the midfield rather than the front line. But in fairness, when he was asked to play in the front line, he was effective and he did score goals. So it's sort of an interesting debate, because if you're just saying that Newcastle are going to sign a forward and cover for Tonali, and you need to find a way of those not just being bit part players, but actually improving the squad, then to get everybody in and keep everyone happy, personally, I would be changing the formation. If you're only on paper trying to keep everyone happy and field a theoretical strongest 11. But if you're thinking about Newcastle and what works, you'd be nuts to go with paper over reality. And the reality is that this 4-3-3 works because it's good for Trippier. It's good for the left back, who personally I think should now be Livramento, not Dan Burn or Lewis Hall, because I think Livramento's been outstanding. So that will be an interesting one to watch. We know that there's plenty of centre-back depth playing with 2 centre-backs, especially when Botman returns. We know that it's right for Bruno. We've seen that Joe Linton's perfectly fine, more than fine, excellent in that midfield. And there's loads and loads of competition for whoever the third name is, because as you've already said, Miley's doing well. Longstaff has been excellent. Let's wait and see what happens when Elliot Anderson comes back. And when you're only looking at 3 in midfield, even with Tonali out, there's never going to be any worry about finding 3 to play there. And then obviously Isak is on fire. And if Almiron can find the kind of form that he started last season with up until the World Cup, it's just the perfect formation. It's wide, it's fast, it's direct. It lends itself towards the counter attack. It's difficult to play against. You don't need that extra man in midfield. So I think maybe fans to an extent need to almost stop thinking about an individual addition or 2 and then trying to work it into a hypothetical starting 11 and just accept that 4-3-3 is perfect for Newcastle. And if in that 4-3-3 you're winning games and you've got competition from many places, maybe they don't need a big January.
Yeah, I would say that they probably don't. It's just that injury list. They've got to get it sorted out. Okay, we've only got 6 minutes left, and this could be a question which you're going to have to come with an abridged answer, because Kipper McFish likes to jump in with questions which are of a political nature. He said, keen to know Ben's opinion on the view from PIF on the continuous attempts by the EPL members to bring in rules to hamper the NUFC Saudi project. Clearly, the Saudis employ the very best brains when it comes to their business strategies. Do you think PIF are simply playing a clever long game?
No, I think that football is just changing, and I've said this before, and I'll repeat it briefly again. I don't think we should look at the vote or any changes to the Premier League rules as only Newcastle focused. I know that it's really easy to leap to that conclusion, and every fan that follows Newcastle may feel like this is a reaction to Newcastle, but some of the conversations around the Premier League predate Newcastle, and because Neves, in my opinion, has never really been a possibility, I don't think they did the related party loans vote only because of Newcastle or only because of a Neves possibility. You also have to remember that now there's a large proportion of Premier League clubs that have got connections with other clubs, and multi-club is the way forwards. And we are going to have to realign the rules to the modern football landscape, which is not just Newcastle, it's Chelsea's multi-club model. It might be Ineos and Manchester United's multi-club model. It's City Football Group. Forest are in a multi-club model. Sheffield United are in a multi-club model. Brighton are in a multi-club model. And even the clubs that are not officially multi-club have all got partners. And even when you don't have multi-club on the commercial side, as you get bigger owners, American owners coming in, they've got other business interests, and they may choose to use those other business interests to partner up legally, but there may be more scrutiny or there may be more guidance needed on the rules. So I can't stress enough that this is not really what we saw on November the 21st, only about transfers. There was also a commercial vote about related party transactions. And remember, Chelsea have just signed Infinite Athlete on their shirt. That went to a fair market value panel. Newcastle have obviously done commercial deals in Saudi Arabia and renewed their airline deal recently. So I think it's normal that a solution needs to be found. And this ban in January was not long term. It was only temporary, allowing everyone to come together and find a consensus as to what the way forwards is. So I don't think that PIF are worried. I don't think that PIF actually feel particularly victimized. I just think that modern football is changing and the rules have to move along with it. And remember the other thing in all of this, that people will say, well, it's bashing Newcastle, it's restricting Newcastle. It isn't in many ways, because even if the rules become more stringent, you can't just block a deal. And that's, I think, the thing that people are forgetting. This is about how you value fair market and how you police fair market. But if Newcastle come along and want to do something with a related party, it can't be blocked. It can only be scrutinized. And then potentially the amount could be changed if it's not deemed to be fair market value, or potentially the club could be penalized in some way. But again, it can't be blocked. And that's really important, because people are viewing this as the Premier League stopping these type of transactions, when actually they're trying to find a solution as to how we get transparency and how we consistently calculate fair market value. And why are we trying to do that? We're trying to do that so in the long run, more of these deals can be done, not less of these deals can be done. But when they're done fairly and transparently. And that's why people wanted the ban, so we could establish what the protocol was to allow more of this kind of business. Again, not less of this kind of business. So this is not really about blocking. It's about formulating rules and banning until we have a clear protocol. And once there is a clear protocol, then yes, it might change certain things in terms of values or process. But again, it's not going to block. And I think that many fans feel like they're being victimized because of that block element. But this isn't about blocking. It's about policing.
Quick prediction for Newcastle versus Everton, which is, of course, on Thursday, Ben.
Oh, I think Newcastle win that game. I think that Newcastle will be far too strong for Everton, who were quite good, actually, against Manchester United, even though they ended up losing 3-0. So it's not an easy place to go, Everton. And it's sort of tough now for, I think, Newcastle, just because they have got a very congested period with injuries. So got to go away at Everton and then away at Spurs and then play Milan in a massive game. But obviously, because the Everton game isn't directly before that Milan match, I think it will be a strong team. It'll be interesting to see what he does in the Spurs game, equally as big, maybe even bigger in the context of the race for Champions League football. But I think you've got to go and get a win at Everton with your strongest possible 11. I think that's absolutely vital, because if you rest the players for the Everton game first with a view to Spurs and Milan, and then you lose at Everton, then you've got to suddenly win at Spurs. Otherwise, all hell breaks loose. And then if you don't then get out your Champions League group, it's a run of 3 games and panic starts to set in maybe ahead of the festive period. So I think what Newcastle need to do is field their strongest 11 at Everton, beat Everton. I think they'll beat Everton 2-1. And then it takes a bit of pressure off going away at Spurs. Get something from Spurs if you can. Never an easy place to go, but they're struggling with injuries as well. And then obviously you go and play Milan at home. And I fully expect Newcastle, whether they go through or not in the Champions League, to beat Milan. And if they can beat Milan, beat Everton and draw at Spurs, regardless of, as I say, if they go through or not in the Champions League, that's a really good and positive run of results heading into the mid-December and festive period. So yeah, my prediction for the Everton game is 2-1 to Newcastle. And I think that will set them up nicely heading into that big week in mid-December of away at Spurs, home to Milan.
Ben Jacobs, thanks as always. See you again soon, mate. Take care.
Look forward to it. All the best.